It's been a little bit more than 2 years since the death of Robert White. He was killed by Officer Anand Badgujar, and you started this petition to reopen the investigation into the officer. Can you tell me why you decided to start this petition?
Yeah, I mean, I think after George Floyd's death, we've seen communities across the country begin to demand justice in cases of police brutality that either had gone unrecognized, meaning that there was no public scrutiny, or that the investigation themselves were absolutely unsatisfactory. And that's the case with the investigation into the shooting of Robert White. So it was a good time to do so, I think, given what's going on in our nation.
As an activist, what problems did you have with the investigation into the officer who shot Robert White?
The first problem is that police cannot be trusted to investigate themselves. And that's currently the system that we have in Montgomery County. So what we're planning to do is, after we've amassed a sufficient number of signatures from the community, and as of yesterday we had 500 signatures, we're planning to ask the county executive and the police chief to work with an outside organization to conduct another investigation. We do not think it was fair or impartial. We think that outgoing police chief Major did just a really sham investigation into the shooting, and it left more questions than what were answered.
That's the former police chief, right?
Chief Major, yes, former police
Okay.
chief.
So you do not feel that justice was served last time around? I believe the report came out, was it in April of last year or June of last year?
As I recall, it was April, and
Okay.
So a report that absolved an officer of all wrongdoing when, the stop in this case was initiated because Mr. White was just walking, and that was deemed suspicious enough by a police officer in this county to stop him to stop him and to begin to ask him questions about what he was doing. If that's enough to stop somebody in the county, particularly somebody of color, in a Silver Spring neighborhood with a very diverse community, I think the community needs more information than what was given to us in a 2-page report that said that the officer did everything perfectly.
And in your petition, you talk about how the officer is still working for the police department. Could you talk a little bit about that as well, about, as an activist, how you perceive seeing him go to work every day after something like this happens?
Well, we have a lot of concern. I mean, as we're seeing, particularly in Minnesota with what happened with George Floyd and the officer who was involved, Derek Chauvin, that officer had a long history of complaints against him. Unfortunately, we do not know what the officer's history is who killed Robert White. And a lot of that has to do with the way that state law is construed in Maryland, which needs to be overturned. Complaints against police officers are shielded from public scrutiny due to the Public Information Act, which, on its face sounds like that's the place where people should be able to go to get this type of information. But it has worked actually in the opposite way when it comes to police officers, saying that complaints against them are considered personnel files. So in the case of Officer Badgujar, who killed Robert White, we don't know what he did prior to shooting Robert White, and we don't know what he's done since. And as a member of the community, as a Black member of the community and an activist, that does concern me.
How many signatures do you want, are you hoping the petition receives, and what is your ultimate goal by, if you reach that amount of signatures, what goal do you want from there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we had a set number of signatures in mind. As I mentioned when I checked yesterday, we had over 500 signatures, which I think is just great, considering that, our local cases aren't getting the level of media that some of the other cases are getting. So, but it shows that folks in Silver Spring and in Montgomery County have enough concern that 500 people have signed our petition. What we'd like to do is to present it to County Executive Elrich, who has proposed a few things, one of which was to hire a civilian assistant police chief, and another was to hire an outside consulting firm to do some review of practices and procedures within the police department. Well, I think for the county executive and also for our new police chief that they have a pretty easy starting point if they want to show the community that Montgomery County Police are going in a new direction, and we're going to follow where communities, including ours, communities across the country and ours, are saying we need to be in terms of transparency and accountability. Why not start with saying something went wrong here if a Black man walking down the street is stopped because he's got a rip in his jacket, and it becomes obvious, during the course of the stop that this man has a mental disability, yet he's pursued with a weapon, drawn on him, and he reacts in a way that somebody experiencing mental disability would under that stress, and he ends up being shot 9 times. Why not just admit that something went wrong there? We never got that. The family never got an apology. There was no acknowledgement that anything went wrong with the officer's behavior. So if that's the case, how do we know that we're turning a page in Montgomery County?
Do you think if the case was to be reopened, there has been a lot of, after the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, people have been talking about maybe there's a reckoning happening right now with racism and police brutality. If there is some chance that the case gets reopened, are you hopeful that maybe this time around justice could be served?
Yeah, I mean, I particularly, we're talking about looking at procedure, right, and practice in the police department. So again, I think it would be pretty easy to say that we don't stop people just because they're out walking around and they've got a rip in their clothing. I mean, to me, that's fairly low-hanging fruit, just to say, that was wrong. We will not tolerate racial profiling from our officers, and that's what occurred in the case of Robert White's initial stop. And again, once Robert was stopped and it became clear that he was highly agitated, that the officer was dealing with somebody who had, a mental illness or, some emotional, a different emotional reaction to the stop. The county, the officer didn't call, for mental health resources because it's not mandated in this county. Another easy thing to do. Officers are going to come in contact with people who are mentally ill. There are some encouraging signs. County Council Member Tom Hucker has introduced a special appropriation to fund mobile mental health crisis units in the county. I think that's great. I think that's needed. But if they're optional, and officers don't have to call them when they know they're dealing with somebody who's in mental distress, I'm afraid that we will continue to see a repeat of the shooting of Robert White and then Fanan Burhi, which we saw again in 2020. So there are some things that we hope to be accomplished with the reopening of this case, because it would mean that the police department and our county executive could acknowledge where they went wrong. And until you can acknowledge that, how can you fix it?
So it sounds like part of the petition, part of the goal is to change some of the policy and to get the department to address issues around racial profiling. And the other part of the petition, it sounds like, is also wanting more accountability for Officer Badgujar, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that sets an example, I think, for other police officers, right? So if you can initiate this kind of stop, if you can chase the person, with a weapon drawn, when there has been no crime committed, you're not in hot pursuit of a felon or anything like that. It's just a man who was walking down the street and didn't want to be stopped by a police officer. And then once it became clear that the person was emotionally distressed, and we didn't see any sort of training kick in, from the officer where he could have de-escalated the situation. We didn't see that at all. Obviously, taking the gun out and then pursuing him with the gun aggravated the situation. And then to have the police department, the internal affairs investigation say that the officer was perfectly reasonable and did everything by the book and policy, I think sends the wrong message to other police officers in the county. This is not the type of policing that makes community members safe. It's not the type of policing that we want officers learning in the academy or putting into practice on our streets.
So would you like to hear, you've talked a little bit about kind of policy you want Elrich to implement. What do you want to hear from Chief Jones? Do you want to hear him say that a person like Robert White should be alive right now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want him to say, I'm taking a new direction with this police department. And what happened in that case, I assure you, was wrong. It is not something that, it's not the way we train our officers. It's not the way that we want to see our officers perform, in a similar situation. And we're taking steps to address that. But we haven't seen that with Chief Jones because, Chief Jones, I have not heard him represent the types of ideas that are consistent with the changes that are being called for from communities across the country. I've heard Chief Jones defend the actions of the officer. I've heard him defend the shooting. So I don't have high hopes there, which is why I think that if the case were reopened, it would be absolutely critical to have an outside entity do the investigation. For example, the Attorney General's office. Another great idea would be to link up with academy like Georgetown University. They do great work in their legal center on cases around policing. We've seen, in Prince George's County very recently, that an independent investigation was done, not at the request of the county, but the ACLU of Maryland, that uncovered all of these abuses that the police chief allowed to go on, and that actually members of the police force, Hispanic members and Black members of the police force, had been complaining about for years in terms of the treatment that they saw white officers exhibiting with Black and Latino folks out in Prince George's County. So it's critical that you get a set of outside eyes, outside of the police department and police culture to take a look at these things. So that's what we'd like.
Okay. You mentioned Tom Hucker's bill. Have you heard, are there any other, I guess I have two questions. My first question before I get to the one I was about to say is, what other officials could you tell me about any other officials that are supportive of this petition right now?
Yes, Delegate Janelle Wilkins, our state delegate, Robert White was a constituent of hers, has been very supportive of the petition and reopening the case. So we do have some support from our elected officials.
And we have seen more policy being written by the county council. Is there any other proposals that you've seen that you feel hopeful about?
Yeah, I mean, so Tom Hucker's appropriation to have more mobile mental health units are great. Will Jawando has a bill to limit the use of force in the county, which I think is great. One of the things that it would do is mandate de-escalation, which we didn't see the officer use in the shooting of Robert White, or again later with the shooting of Anand. I think that those things are very helpful. Unfortunately, a lot of this is sort of piecemeal, when really what we need is like comprehensive reform. We need comprehensive reform and accountability in our county, but also at the state level as well.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me. Is there anything else that you wanted to add that I didn't ask you about?
Just that, every time something like this happens and there's a lack of accountability, that it causes great pain for the family members, and that includes the family members of Robert White, who continue to want to see justice in this case, in the shooting of Robert White.